Much for joining us, either in person or online. My name's Mark Crunden-White. I'm a retrofit surveyor for People Powered Retrofit, and I'll be comparing the early part of this evening's activities, which is split into two distinct sections. We're running two events today. The first is a public session which runs from 5 till 7, which is exploring the role of early adopters in retrofit. And this discussion is open to everyone and live streamed on YouTube, and we will be taking questions and having a question and answer session too. So that's 5 till 7. From 7 o'clock until 8, we'll be running People Powered Retrofit's first ever AGM, our annual general meeting. And this session is only available exclusively to PPR members. So this is a bit of a first for us. We're running a hybrid in-person and online event, and it's quite ambitious given our normal level of expertise. So we wanted to do this particularly because people wanted to come along in person, which is absolutely fine. And we wanted to meet those people as well and let them meet each other. Plus, we have a number of members who live around the UK, and so we wanted to involve as many people as possible. But I do stress it's an ambitious undertaking, so please bear with us for any technical glitches. But barring technical disaster, we should be continuing. We should be starting off with our first discussion, which is who are the early adopters? And the theme of this session is who are the early adopters for retrofit? So early adopters is a term, it's not particular to retrofit. Generally, these are the people who are always on the lookout for something new or to meet an existing need that they have. We can identify early adopters in the rollout of any new service or product, from mobile phones to electric vehicles to buy-to-let mortgages. So products and services across the board, there's always going to be an element of early adopters. They're often the first to try something out. They're keen to get involved and sometimes more tolerant of services that are new or in development. Think of the kind of people who jump at the chance to test a beta piece of software, for instance. Today, we're going to explore the relevance of early adopters to retrofit in particular, asking who they are, what their motivations are, how we can service their needs, and how we can move beyond early adopters towards a mass market for retrofit. So coming up, we have a panel of experts to offer their views. But firstly, we have Cara Holmes of Citizens Advice, who is joining us online. Cara is a senior policy researcher at Citizens Advice, and they've been carrying out some fascinating research into net zero and associated services. And earlier in 2023, Cara authored a report entitled Demand Net Zero, which specifically looked at householder interest in retrofit. So providing you're here, Cara, this does feel rather like the Eurovision Song Contest. Providing you're there, take it away.
Perfect, thanks so much. Wave if you can hear me. I think I'm speaking. Oh yeah, I can see a wave. Perfect. Hello, everybody. I will now share my screen. And I'll talk a little bit about early adopters. Right, here we go. Who are the early adopters? Yeah, so thank you so much for the intro. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we did last year. I am actually going to focus specifically on heat pumps today, because I feel like those show up quite a lot of the trends for the other retrofit measures, but like slightly more exacerbated because they're more expensive. But if anyone is particularly interested in other retrofit measures, the report looks at demand for those as well and like breaks it down separately. I'll start off with a little bit of context just as to like why do we care about retrofit. So we've got the heat and building strategy, looking for a minimum of 600,000 heat pump installations by 2028. This was to be done by reducing costs and hopefully to be bringing heat pumps in line with gas boilers. But we're off. We're not anywhere near. So all of those benefits that decarbonised heating could bring to the environment, and also where kind of more efficient buildings could be brought for homeowners, are just not here at the moment. And recent announcements from the government not really helping us move towards these targets. So I think, as everyone can probably imagine, last week was quite frustrating for us working in energy policy. But so a little bit about the research that we did that I'm going to talk about. So we did an online survey of 12,000 adults in February this year. We looked at interest in and affordability of energy efficiency measures in low carbon heating. And what we did is we actually looked at each measure individually. So although I'm not going to cover that today in this presentation, because I'm only focusing on heat pumps, what I found was quite interesting as a part of that research was actually we talk a lot about like this kind of like able to pay market, or like this interested market. People are interested in home retrofit, but actually interest and demand just fluctuated wildly between the different measures. So between like cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, things like that, glazing. So kind of I almost concluded that there isn't really this thing, like this kind of homogenous idea of an able to pay market actually doesn't really exist, because people have different motivations, people have different things in their homes already. So like really we're looking at kind of measure by measure interest. But back to the data, so data is weighted, nationally representative. And then what we did secondary to the survey was did some statistical analysis. I mean, I say we, I mean the research agency, did some statistical analysis, which basically allows us to map those results onto the UK on a constituency by constituency basis. So what that does is it kind of basically takes the characteristics of the people that are interested in heat pumps and says, okay, so we know this kind of person is interested, and we know around the country that kind of person is here, here, and here. So we'll look at the mapping in a minute, but what I would like to stress with that is that this isn't like exactly where people with heat pumps are living right now. It's an indication of higher or lower levels of demand. So what we were able to do from our research was really to pull out a consumer like segmentation and really drill down into some of the demographics of like who are those people that are actually the most interested and who are most likely to kind of be part of this or take part in this retrofit journey. So I'll start with the left-hand side of not interested. Don't have a heat pump, not interested. And this is the largest segment. I don't necessarily think anyone will be surprised by that. That's about 15 million adults. But actually what I was surprised by is that when we start to move to the side and we see this group of interested but unwilling, so these are people that are interested in a heat pump, but when we ask them, could you afford one out of your regular income, or would you be prepared to borrow for one? They weren't interested, but they did still have some interest in the device itself. It was just the finances where it kind of fell apart. So that's actually 6.5 million adults around. So I think that was kind of more than I expected. And then we have the able to pay group. These are people that are interested in a heat pump and they can afford the upfront cost without any additional borrowing. Then there's the willing to borrow. So those are people that couldn't afford the upfront cost but were willing to either take a mortgage or a loan. So those two segments jointly represent about 2.5 million adults, and a little over half are able to pay, with the remainder willing to borrow. So I thought as well, like actually when we talk about sort of heat pump demand and we talk about early adoption and we talk about like kind of moving towards net zero, I think we're always thinking no one wants it, no one's going to get it, like the demand is not there. And actually I think what I took away from our research is actually that there are more people who are interested than I would have thought. I mean, 2.5 million, if we can kind of mobilize this segment of people, that's actually quite a lot of people. And I think we've already heard sort of about like how adoption of new technologies works, right? It's always going to be in this sort of normal distribution anyway. So we're looking at that bell curve. We're never going to see like a huge spike at the beginning. We're looking to see this kind of gradual increase, and then the bulk of people will move later. So I really think it's actually quite interesting to focus on these segments at the right and see like, how do we get them going? Because if we can get them going, we can start to build a market and we can start to create demand. We can start to normalize these technologies in people's homes. So if we just want to look a little bit about like, who are these people? So they're not interested, as I said, larger segment. When we asked why they weren't interested, actually cost was a significant issue. And so people were saying heat pumps too expensive, and they're also saying they're waiting for prices to come down. So although these people are saying they're not interested, actually, I still think a large part of that disinterest is contingent on prices and like how the market is looking like at the moment. So homeowners not interested in heat pumps are more likely to be over 65. They're more likely to be white. So that's white ethnicity. As we get into some of the other segments, actually, we saw some interesting things around ethnicity. They have an annual household income under £40,000 a year. more likely to live in the southeast or southwest of England and own their homes outright, which kind of chimes with the age, the over 65s. I will caveat actually also all of this, these are homeowners only. So we only ask people basically that agency over change how interested they were, because despite actually the wider survey did show that like tenants are more concerned about the energy efficiency of their homes and report worse energy efficiency, they don't have agency really in the main to change much. So we thought when looking specifically at demand, it was more appropriate to focus on homeowners. So these people also actually interestingly think their home retains heat well. So this was something that I found really shocking, is that we asked people how well or badly do you think your home retains heat, and I thought people were going to say badly. Turns out most people think their home retains heat well, which is interesting from a decarbonisation and a retrofit point of view, because actually people don't realise, because objectively we know that like most homes aren't actually performing that well in terms of heat retention and energy efficiency. But if people don't realise that, they're not going to be motivated to see these products and to make changes, because they're just seeing it as like unnecessary outlay when they already think they live in this like, you know, super comfortable home. So I think that's really something to consider and to think about when we look at sort of targeting and promotion, is that if people think that they're in a good situation, they're not necessarily going to be seeking out products and to be spending money on new things. So these are also smaller households, 1 or 2 people, and lower levels of disposable income. So the interested and unwilling, yeah, as I said, interested, can't afford upfront costs. So they're likely to be 25, 54. What was actually striking to me was that there was a decent like regional variation in levels of interest and ability to pay. So Yorkshire and the Humber and Wales had quite high levels of interest, but lower levels of ability to pay. One hypothesis I can think of as to why that might be, I think especially in Wales, so this is me sitting actually in rural West Wales, I've just moved, I'm off the gas grid, it's awful. I'm wondering if the level of interest actually is slightly increased or boosted by the fact that there's more people off the gas grid and are kind of struggling with unregulated markets for oil and LPG. So yeah, interest in heat pumps more likely to be Asian British. So this was a theme across all of the measures that we looked at, which was actually that non-white ethnicities were more interested in all of the measures, and specifically Asian British people. So we don't really know why that is, and we're doing some kind of further research into why that could be, but that was a really interesting sort of thing to come out. There's quite a big difference in interest by ethnicity. Then those who are interested but not willing to pay. Oh, any idea what proportion of homes are flats? We did ask that, and I could probably pull that out, and it's an interesting thing to pull out, so I will note it and pull it out the data. Hopefully I will be able to share some of this stuff afterwards. So yeah, that is a really interesting question, because we ask people loads of stuff. This is like a gigantic data set. How many live in flats? So yeah, these people 40k to 60k, the interest goes up as the income goes up, have a mortgage. They think their home retains heat badly, actually, cut back on energy consumption last winter, struggling with essential bill payment, and have quite low levels of disposable income. Also might be a factor in determining why they're unwilling, because they know actually that they can't afford a loan. I think one thing that I've been kind of thinking about is that traditional financial products, a heat pump is just expensive, right? So like even on 0% interest, the monthly repayments for a heat pump are going to be quite high if you're getting on like just the traditional sort of unsecured loan. And so for people in this segment, I think that could potentially be a barrier. And they have children with a household size of over 3 people, like I have here, although we have household size of 4. And then they're able to pay.
Mommy, who's talking?
I'm talking. Yeah, so 5% of homeowners are interested in a heat pump and able to afford the upfront cost without additional borrowing. So they're likely to be under 35. They live in London. You need to get daddy to help you then. They have household income over 60k a year, own their home outright. So when we're looking at these demographics, as someone pointed out, and under 35 living in London, owning their home outright. Shocker. This doesn't necessarily, not all of these points will apply to all of these, like to one person. So this isn't necessarily a pen portrait of a person. These are just particular factors about people in this group. So some of them might hold true, but some of them, it's very unlikely that all of them hold true for them, because yeah, under 35, owning your home outright and living in London is, I mean, maybe I'd like to be that person. So these people actually are off gas grid, likely to be off gas grid, oil boilers, electric radiators, electric storage heaters. Again, kind of linking with the hypothesis that people who have higher energy costs are actually more motivated and interested. And also people who kind of deal with hassle of living off grid, organising their own deliveries, etc. They think their home retains heat well. They're not cutting back on energy spending. They can easily cover their essentials. They've got high levels of disposable income. They live in larger households. And then the willing to borrow. So around 4% of interested homeowners weren't able to afford upfront costs, but were willing to borrow. We asked about mortgage borrowing and unsecured loans. And mortgage borrowing is massively preferred, with only 1 in 10 of those willing to borrow preferring an unsecured loan over a mortgage. So at the moment, yeah, loans very much not popular. We didn't really drill down into like what kind of loan it could be. So, you know, there could be variables that could change that or whatever. But it's, yeah, as it stands on our very basic questioning, that is what it looked like. And then these people, 25 to 54, live in East Midlands, again, Asian British, household income over 60k, owning with a mortgage, thinking their home retains heat badly, have like a mid-level of disposable income, so like 500 to £1,000, have children and large household sizes, actually like quite often with household sizes of 6 or more. So this is where we move now onto the mapping. So if you look at the map on the left, you can see the percentage of adults who are interested in the heat pump. Green is high, red is low. And when I looked at this, I was thinking like, what is going on? Like, what are all these red spots? And then I realized this was all adults. It wasn't homeowners. So in the map on the right, I stripped out the non-homeowners, and I think we see a little bit more accurate picture, because actually in the urban areas, there's just more likely to be rental accommodation. So that was skewing things a little bit. Then here, this is the same map. The map on the left is percentage of homeowners interested in a heat pump. But then on the right, we've got percentage of homeowners who are able to pay or willing to borrow. So like where in Wales, actually, we can see like decent areas of interest, or like maybe in the southwest. Then when we look at ability to pay, actually it's those urban centres where interest is maybe not as high, but ability to pay is better. So if we zoom in on London here, you can see that same thing. So in most places where interest was higher, ability to pay, it just was like a little bit lower. Whereas actually in London, what I could see, and like I think it's the same for some other urban areas, was that actually there were some really high pockets of interest, but were linked with very low levels of ability to pay. So it's again something to bear in mind when we're looking at planning for like kind of local areas or regions. If we're looking at sort of area-based schemes and things like that, like, are we targeting appropriately to the people that are interested and able to pay, and how do we kind of communicate those two messages of sort of financial support or just ability to pay? So my conclusion was there is interest if we can mobilize it. Like, come on, like, let's not just cancel net zero, like, let's try and mobilize the interest, please. But different tactics likely to be needed for each segment. And I think this is where, like, I'm really interested to hear from people in the room, because, you know, we've got the data, but we don't necessarily have the answers. So yeah, these is kind of my questions for you, and like really happy to take away questions and like answer them sort of outside of this meeting, or I think we've got some time afterwards as well to chat. So people on lower incomes least likely to be interested. What does that mean for retrofit schemes? Like, we know that ECO and the energy company obligation so far has not been, ECO4 has not been particularly successful. Is part of that because actually the people that it's targeting are not interested in those retrofit measures, and how do we then change that narrative and shift that dial? And then the interested but unable to pay are most likely to be struggling financially. So will those traditional financial products be affordable for them? Like, or are they going to have to be looking at such long loan terms? They're then struggling up against, like, I can't leave my house because I can't sell it because I can't like pay off this loan or whatever. So is there an alternative? What can we do? Something that I think is quite interesting to think about, we haven't done that much thinking about it, is like kind of heat as a service models, or sort of leasing of products or things like this. So yeah, I think that's like going to be a really interesting thing to explore as we move forward, is how to bring the cost of those products within reach of people and have the finance that kind of backs that up. Then many of the able to pay are off the gas grid. So can we better sell the financial benefits of heat pumps, particularly and specifically to people that are off the gas grid? Massive pity, in my opinion, that the 2026 ban of new oil boilers was scrapped. I think that was like a huge missed opportunity, but there we are. I mean, people are still struggling with unregulated markets, so there should still be some kind of element of pull there. And I also thought about like adding solar panels. Does that make a more attractive offer if you can say like we can offset some of that cost, or like ongoing running costs with solar? Then cities follow slightly different trends than other areas with lower interests but better ability to pay. So how do local areas best make use of that information in their planning and their communication? So those are my big questions, but I mean, I'm happy to also answer any other questions. And that is my presentation. So thank you so much, and excuse the little interruption. It's I normally start working at 5, so they're like, what is going on? But yeah, happy to answer any questions. And if there are any that I can't answer, then we'll see if we can do that by email or like, yeah, offline. So thank you very much, very much, very much, very much.
Very much enjoyed the echo there. We seem to be. Are we? Yes, there we go. Fantastic. Sorry. That was absolutely fantastic, Cara, and some really interesting insights that you shared with us there. Yeah, it's quite ironic, really. I mean, you know, you said about a couple of governmental missteps and what have you, and it's interesting that you mentioned tenants there as well, in terms of most, very interested in energy efficiency measures and heat pumps and things, because they pay the most for their fuel. And yet another thing that that our friends in Power have done recently is scrap the energy efficiency standards for landlord-owned properties. Hooray! So there we go, yet another misstep. But anyway, we could spend all evening going about that, but we won't. But just one thing I wanted to pick up on, it was one of your early points. You were saying that there was quite a fluctuation in terms of like the interest between measure choices. I mean, were those sort of like purely financially driven, or were those sort of like I guess the sort of perception of upheaval for certain things?
Yeah, so there was a few different reasons actually. So the measures we looked at were the low cost, so like the cavity wall, the loft, and then like the kind of middle cost, like your like a double glazing and something that escapes my mind. And then we looked at solid wall and heat pumps, and like actually the kind of was it? Oh no, I said glazing, whatever.
Mind by about 30 seconds, please. I'm sorry, we had a dropout. I don't know if that's with us or with you, but
oh, am I? I can see that I'm frozen. Hang on. Oh, am I back? I think I might be back. I think I can see myself moving. Perfect. Yeah, so we looked at...
Why you come again with that? That'd be great. I do apologise.
That's all right. So we looked at a few different measures. So like there was kind of the lower cost ones, like things that were like £1,000-ish less, so like cavity wall and loft insulation. Those were kind of hampered, actually mostly the demand, by the fact that loads of people had it already. So they weren't necessarily looking to like top up or like do more. And then for the more expensive measures, actually, like so for solid wall, there were some issues where people were saying like, I think it's going to cause problems to my property. That was the same for cavity wall as well. So I think there have been like some kind of, and I guess what I'm kind of cognizant of in this market is that bad news travels really fast. Like if anything new, I think the bad news travels probably faster than the good news. So, you know, like we've had high profile failures of cavity wall insulation where people have had to, they got like damp and like water ingress, and the same for solid wall insulation as well. And these are like really, really costly measures in a kind of unregulated and unprotected market for people to put right. So there was, I think, some reticence there. And I was surprised by the level of people saying, I think it's going to cause additional problems to my property. We were also coming up against the problem of like my home is well insulated enough already, when like it just isn't. You just don't know. You just don't know that it isn't. And I don't think that this would like work for me. So that was specifically around heat pumps. Like people were saying like it's not going to work for me. It's too noisy. It's too big. It's too. So I think what kind of I concluded from that really was that there's such this lack of information and advice. And what I think is quite interesting in this market is that for some bizarre reason, we expect people to know what they want and what they need in their home. Whereas like if my car was broken, I wouldn't tell the mechanic what was wrong. I wouldn't go to him and be like, this is what I want a new whatever. I'd say, what is your diagnosis? And I would trust that and I would apply that. But for some reason in home retrofit, it's like, oh, I want cavity wall insulation, or I want this, or I want that. And people are like, you know, picking measures out of the air. And of course, in a lot of cases, they're going to get it wrong. So I think that really, and what we've called for kind of again and again and again, is just a much better bespoke advice offer. Like it's not really enough that you go online and say, this is what insulation is or does. I need to know if it's right for me, my property, the way that I live in that property, the way that I use energy. So yeah, I think just lack of information across the piece. But those more common measures, people just, they're like, oh, I've already got that. It might be 20 years old, but I've already got that, so I'm not interested in that. And then those other things that maybe people are thinking are a bit more problematic, I think there is a bit of a hang up about causing issues and go like extended problems with damp and water.
That sounds very relevant. That's very much what we find as well in terms of sort of people's perceptions of things. And as you say, the bad news seems to travel quicker and louder than the good news, unfortunately, which is and there's no shortage of people waiting to sort of like, you know, kind of to have a pop at insulation measures and the whole net zero thing, as we're all too aware. But I'm sure we've got quite a few questions from what I could see going on whilst you're talking, Cara. So we'll throw it open to the audience, but we'll throw it open to the online audience initially. Harriet, do we have any questions?
Hey, Mark. Can you hear me and see me okay? Great.
Hello, Switzerland. Hello, Sandy. Hello, Sandy. Do we have any questions for Cara?
Great. Hopefully that's working. I thought it'd just be easier if I just read out the questions from the chat. So we have a question from Chris, who's asking about willingness to pay. So he says, I appreciate willingness to pay is a classic economist consideration, but let's not forget people have aesthetic interests. Has anyone in the UK looked at other unwillingness reasons, i.e. on aesthetic grounds?
That is super interesting. And yeah, that came up quite strongly for heat pumps, that people like, it's too big, it's too ugly and stuff like that. Yeah, I used the word willingness to pay because it's a phrase that is easily understood, but it's not necessarily my preferred term, because I think what the research kind of showed me is that actually quite a lot of people have quite a lot of money. They just don't want to spend it on this stuff. And so I think we really need to dig down into why that is, because you can't force people to spend money on things they don't want to have. So how do we kind of, one, convince those early adopters, but two, make the mass market feel more comfortable? And yeah, I think kind of there are sort of improvements in this market all the time, but yeah, aesthetics, I mean, it is a thing. Although I have to say, I would rather have a heat pump than an oil tank, which is what I currently have in my garden, which is gigantic and vile, and no one really seems to complain about those.
I think what might be an idea from here is if we sort of like switch between online and in the room, possibly, because obviously we have a physical audience too. Anyone in the physical audience, do we have any questions? We have somebody at the back there. Would you want to come up and speak into the microphone? Is that okay?
That's all right. Yeah, thanks for that, Cara. I was assuming the research was carried out back under the old scheme when the heat pumps were still several £1,000s, and obviously, you know, Octopus coming and saying they'll do one for 500 quid now, potentially a game changer. And do you think that would swing many of the people around? I suppose it's quite hard to ask the hypotheticals, but I don't know, is there a point in the revisit of the survey once that the £500
Yeah, for sure.
If it's real, to me, it is a bit too good to be true, isn't it? It's great.
Yeah, I think first day that was announced, I went on to Octopus's website and tried to sign up, and I found out that they're not installing in Wales. So that was sad for me. Yeah, for sure. So like we did this survey in Feb 2023. So yeah, like earlier this year. And I think at that point, like kind of energy costs were high, and people were like really feeling it after a long winter of high costs, right? So I definitely think the timing that these things happen makes a big difference. And I think it's always actually worth sort of monitoring attitudes and behaviors, because I think it's going to help with our targeting. So yeah, definitely think it's worth it. And I guess in purely in response to sort of like bringing down costs, I still think other things are needed beyond financial. So I still think like that advice and that education is still needed regardless of the cost, because actually we are going to kind of, if we are looking at early adopters, those are going to be the people that are changing outside of like regulation, right? Like the regulation is gone now. So when we don't even have 2030 or whatever to look forward to. So I think if we're wanting people to like literally change heating systems and not just replace broken ones, I think, yes, the cost helps, but they need a reason to do that. And I think that's why I'm like particularly interested, I suppose, in the off-gas grid, because I think they have more motivation, more reason than most. I really struggle to see how we will mobilize adoption of heat pumps outside of people that have extremely high incomes, unless this is more than a financial question, unless it's something that is more than just spending money, because actually £500 is still quite a lot to a lot of people. So yeah, I think that we kind of need the whole package. We need the advice, we need the information, and yeah, we need the finances as well. And like we also kind of need like a less hostile policy environment would be helpful as well. I think regulation is a tool that can help and can work.
It's interesting that you said that. You mentioned Octopus there, and we had a point about aesthetics. I don't know if you've been unlucky enough to actually see the Octopus heat pumps that they're rolling out. Absolutely terrible. Looks like some kind of like municipal bin. They're absolutely dreadful. Anyway, but that's just purely a point on aesthetics. I'm sure they're absolutely wonderful, and we should all get one. So back to Sandy and the online contingent. Sandy, do we have any more questions, please?
Yeah, we have quite a few. I'm going to just ask maybe two questions at once, which are both sort of about the methodology of the research. So we had Jason, who was asking about the not interested and happy with heat retention, and whether they were asked about their bills and what their bills have been like. And then we also had a question from Paul, who's asking about the number of adults and whether you were kind of looking at the number of households or the number of adults in the UK. He was just wondering about that.
Right, yeah, so not interested, yeah, happy with the heat retention. So we did ask loads of questions. So we asked questions about whether they'd cut back on their energy costs. People had cut back on energy costs. We asked not directly about how much they were, but like whether they were struggling to pay for their energy costs, as I recall. And there weren't at least any statistically significant differences. So those demographics that I pulled out were the ones where the percentages were like kind of different enough for it to not be by accident, basically. So because with any kind of survey like this, you can always get, even with a huge sample size like we had, like some kind of just non-relevant differences. So yeah, those were statistically significant. So yeah, there might be some other underlying things in there about their bills, but nothing that like really jumped out to me, at least at the time. And then on adults rather than households, number of adults in relationship with heat pump, fact number of, so total adults, as I believe in the UK, is 53 million, but I might have to come back on that methodology point. I'm pretty sure it's adults, but it might not be, because this research was done a fair while ago. So yeah, I would have to double check it, which I might be able to do now if someone says a really long question.
Both of your queries, Sandy.
Yep, that's answered them. Do you want to go back to questions in the room, or do you want another one from online?
Why not, indeed. Yes, anyone in the room with another question? Yes, if you could pass the mic there, Harriet, please.
It's not really a question, but it was just continuing on from what the man over there was saying, because I was recently quoted for a heat pump by Octopus, and it came out at £7,500. On 500.
Yeah, I've not seen the £500. I think I saw a £3,000 figure, but I think that's very much contingent on everything being in situ already, i.e. your radiators are correctly sized, your pipe work is correctly sized. When upgrades to pipe work and things are needed, obviously the cost will then start to go up.
Well, this was done without looking at anything anyway.
Ah,
Just an online quote.
I think, right. I can't answer for Octopus, unfortunately. Well, that sounds a little bit.
Because it was a difference.
Yes.
Would that have been maybe before the boiler upgrade scheme increase? Because the
Yes.
£500
It's about £3,000 initially, and then now it's 7,500. I think we have Cara back with the answer, the $53 million question.
Yes, hang on. I'm just checking, double checking my ONS, because I think I've got a number here saying 53 million UK adults, 5% of which then is 2.5 million adults. So yeah, I think it should be adults.
Fortunately, with the Octopus thing, I think it's very difficult. I certainly wouldn't accept anything which is purely an online quote at all. You'll need like a full heat loss survey. You would need somebody to come out, obviously, and they would, as a condition of fitting a heat pump, they would need to be a physical assessment of your property, which will give you a much more accurate figure. Again, it goes back to a point that Cara was making. A lot of talking about people who have already got cavity wall insulation, they've already got loft insulation, and Eco4 is not really taking off, because essentially this is all the low-hanging fruit. So all of the easy stuff is already done, and so Octopus will be probably just quoting the lowest figure to the easiest households to fit. And unfortunately, within retrofit, most of our client base are like their homes are tricky. They're not easy to upgrade, and so hence they come to us. And so it's yeah, I think mass market will always go to the low-hanging fruit and the easiest accomplished jobs and the biggest profit margins. But right, I shall hand back over to Sandy and the online contingent. Any more questions, please, Sandy?
Yeah, we've got a lot. I think we might not get through all of these right now, but some of them maybe we can answer afterwards. So Ian's asking about kind of perceptions of heat pumps. So people seem to be happy to spend up to 30k on a new kitchen, including 3k on a new boiler. Is selling this as heat pump retrofit seen as too negative? Should we try energy upgrade or similar?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think something that we've been thinking about, one is that we don't really talk about the benefits of net zero. We just talk about like the hassle and the cost, and actually like having a fully smart, like integrated home could be amazing, and you could really take advantage of all of that offers. So I don't think we talk about that enough. I also don't think we talk enough actually about the like the health benefits. So I don't think many people are aware of the issues related to having like a gas hob, for example, in their home. I don't think people necessarily take the issue of damp and mold seriously enough. Like these are like serious health concerns. But people don't, I don't think they're on their radar. So yeah, I don't think we talk about the positives enough. I don't think we talk about the extra benefits enough, but I also just think it's natural that there'd be this like reluctance, because it's just, well, I've got this thing, so like why should I get this new thing? if it's not like shinier and better and more amazing. So yeah, I think it's going to remain a little bit of a hard sell. Honestly, I don't see the dial suddenly shifting. I wish that it would, but maybe I'm a little bit pessimistic on that front.
Okay, we got time for a couple more, Mark.
So Sandy, far away.
Cool. So Nicola is asking, you said a lot of people who are able to pay are on electric heating, which means the installation will be more expensive because they might need a new wet heating system or to go for air-to-air heat pump. Is this something that people are aware of? Is this something you looked into?
I would almost be very happy to bet they're not aware. I think most people don't know what any of this really means for them. Yeah, I thought that was kind of weird, actually. I mean, I thought it was kind of weird just how many people want electric heating in general, because like electric heating is just like really not amazing. The number of people still on like storage heaters, trapped on like kind of old tariffs, things like that, like it's actually a surprisingly high amount of people. One thing we did find actually was that electric heating was particularly prevalent in the private rented sector. So again, where people have the least agency and are often in the least efficient homes. So I think that's why, again, as I like referenced regulation earlier, I think that's why the minimum energy efficiency standards were so crucial for the private rented sector, because they're starting from like so far behind. But yeah, I don't think people are aware of any of the changes they're going to need to make. I mean, I literally like, or what it means, what any of it means. And there's so much misinformation. Like I talked to my neighbor the other day and she was saying someone told her that if she didn't rip out her oil boiler, she'd be charged like 15 grand a year until she did or something. It's like people are just making up stuff. So I think it's hard enough like real things to cut through when there's just so much flying here and there, just madness.
Just before we go back to Sandy and the online crew, do we have anyone else in the room with a question? We have time for a couple more. Yes, over there, please, Harriet.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because retrofit measures don't often happen in isolation, particularly with rural and off-gas grid properties looking at heat pumps. Did you have any correlation about sort of the number of measures people might need? Because obviously if you've got very low unenergy efficient house with a lot of heat loss, were people put off by having to do a lot of insulation work before they might be heat pump ready, or was that not really on people's radar yet?
So we didn't go into that much detail. So we just asked people about their like general levels of interest for the measures and then whether they're willing to pay for them. But yeah, one thing that did come out for a reason not to be interested in heat pumps was people didn't think their home was energy efficient enough for it to work. So that did come out. But I don't necessarily, again, think like these specifics are on people's radars. I think they're thinking, oh, it's going to be expensive, but I don't necessarily think they know why. Again, when there's like all of the kind of rumors about having to replace your radiators and this and that, I think people are kind of in their head, they kind of know that it's going to be maybe more than just the device, but I don't necessarily think much of that is grounded in like facts. So yeah, I think levels of awareness, honestly, I don't think we can underestimate how low they are.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're very much right. It does seem like there's, I mean, again, it seems like the misinformation spreads faster than the actual information, which is always quite an annoying thing. But I think we'll just have to leave it there now because we are sort of moving on with the rest of the evening. But thank you very much indeed, Cara. That was fascinating. Is there somewhere where people can look at this study again? Is there any more resources online?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, I can put it in the chat actually before I drop off, but I'll put in a link to the original report, and I can put in my email address as well. So if anyone wants to like contact me, like please honestly feel free. Like we love to talk to people about retrofit. So yeah, I'll put in some links into the chat. But thank you so much for having me, and loved it.
You, Cara, absolutely fantastic. There, Cara Holmes from Citizens Advice. So we're going to move on to the next sort of portion of the evening. We'll be having a selection of experts from the sector, from the retrofit sector, who are going to share their views on early adopters. But first, I'm just going to sort of give a bit of a synopsis of the People Powered Retrofit co-founder, Jonathan Atkinson, he put a feature, well, an article on LinkedIn recently, specifically about early adopters. So bear with me, I'm going to try and condense probably about 10 minutes worth of talking down into about 3. So a key challenge we face is how to scale the retrofit industry to tackle the housing and energy issues ahead. Meeting future ambitions, it involves recognizing the present state of the sector, which is generally small and limited. It's small and limited because we're only currently dealing with the aforementioned early adopters. They occur very early in what's known as the adoption curve. The very first people in the adoption curve are the innovators, who make up about 2.5%, or 5 million of the UK population, if you like. So that's 2.5% of the innovators, and the early adopters make up about 13.5% of people. As mentioned before, these are the kind of people who are receptive to new thinking, always keen to try out new ideas, always interested in looking at what's coming next. There can be a number of motivating factors for that, whether that's just being ahead of the curve, whether that's having something that no other person has, we don't know. But there's a number of motivating factors. It's a progression that's been demonstrated with remarkable consistency across a range of scenarios. And in the context of a new service like retrofit, early adopters are regarded as the lighthouse customers. They're willing to take a new selection and prepared to try it despite any bugs, deficiencies and flaws there might be in the service. They're always prepared to try something new. They'll try out things that are not normal, that their friends and families may not have ever heard of. In many cases, they may be proud of this, as we said, of being different and early to the party. These people are great as they allow service providers to develop new products and services and to test them out, gain feedback, learn what works for people, and to amend or improve accordingly. So what do these people have to do with retrofit? Well, firstly, for a start, as we've already discussed, a retrofit isn't normal. It's not something that everybody is doing up and down the streets of Great Britain. Recent research, as we've just heard from Citizens Advice, indicates that the vast majority of the population don't understand why retrofit is relevant to them. So the vast majority of the population are generally where the market researchers would look to get their evidence. So market research tools identify and cluster generalizations and commonalities, what normal people do. But as the Citizens Advice research shows, the early adopters are by definition not normal. So People Powered Retrofit has a wealth of research on the early adopters for retrofit. After all, they make up our members, beneficiaries and clients. So we have the early adopters, and we know they're a small but perfectly formed bunch of people, but we want to scale up because obviously there is a need to scale up retrofit. While some have mistaken our approach on early adopters as a desire to keep things bespoke and small, nothing could be further from the truth. Engaging with early adopters is a standard stage in the development of any new innovation. There are different approaches to propose to scaling up the retrofit sector, but it should be recognised that scale already exists in local refurbishment, maintenance and improvement construction sector. Every community, after all, has a network of electricians, plumbers, plasterers, joiners, etc., who can be sort of cross-skilled, if you like, into retrofit. So there is therefore no need to invent a whole new industry. We just need to tap into and shift into one that already exists, with the early adopter households working with the newly trained up builders and installers. So our particular route to scale has always been centered around replication of our service and social franchise models, developing successful approaches in the Northwest and working with like-minded organizations to support their adoption and growth all around the country and beyond. Our belief that scaling is more than codified models. It's about personal relationships, long-term collaboration, and basic good business principles. Social replication has worked effectively across diverse sectors in the cooperative movement, and our progress to date is good. So there are positive reasons for optimism. So to discuss just that and all other aspects of early adopters, we can welcome our panel. We have Ian Preston joining us online. Ian is Director of Household Energy Services at the Centre for Sustainable Energy. He has many years of experience in the sector and played an integral role in CSE's Future Proof Service and the new Retrofit West organisation. He's also a published children's author, so if we're all very good boys and girls, then we might get a little taste of that before we go to bed. Also joining us tonight, we have Amy Hield, who is a home energy assessor and technical lead at Cumbria Action for Sustainability, who are a People Powered Retrofit replication partner. Amy herself is an early adopter of retrofit and regularly works with the householders to support their retrofit decision making. And last but by no means least is Marianne Heaslip. She is an architect and highly experienced retrofit designer. She was associate principal at Urbed before co-founding PPR and acting as the organisation's technical director. So welcome to... Right, yes, no problem at all. Well, I'll hand over to the panel in a minute. So I'll kick you off with a couple of questions, just to get you warmed up, as it were. Welcome along, everyone. Thank you for joining us, Ian. So let me see. We've got, sorry, I'll get my right sheet up. So I'll throw this open to anyone who wants to jump in with it. What's your experience of early adopters for retrofit in your work? And what have you found to be their wants, needs, and motivations?
I was kind of thinking of it like a Venn diagram. And people probably fit into more than one category. So there's some people who want to do the right thing. They're concerned about climate change. They get the whole carbon thing, and that's their motivation. There's people who are cold, and so they want to be comfortable. And in with that goes upgrading their house. So quite often some of those clients are, they've maybe recently bought a house and they're doing a major refurbishment on it. And they want to be warm and comfortable and future-proof for their own benefit. And then we have people who are cold because they can't afford to pay their energy bills. And sometimes that's people who are not on a low income, but they've maybe bought a larger property, a rural property, when energy prices were lower, and now they're finding that they can't afford to heat it. And so they're going, we need to do something serious about this. A sticking plaster isn't going to do it. But like I say, those people overlap each other. So it might be that they've got a sustainability interest and a very high fuel bill, or a very high fuel bill and they're very uncomfortable. Yeah, I don't know if you've got different.
Yeah, I think our experience is probably very similar. And it's happening more recently. I think that people are maybe planning other work. So they're thinking about having a kitchen extension done or something like that, and they'd like to make that as energy efficient as it could be, and think about what other, while they've got someone making a mess in the house, and generally kind of mucking about with things like heating systems, that is also an opportunity to do other things. And I think the thing I would note is that it's very rare. It happens sometimes, and people are interested in terms of like what the effect of doing works would be on their bills. But it's where a lot of the policy drivers nationally seem to be focused on. It's about convincing people to do retrofit so that they can save money. Our experience is that that's much more of a secondary thing. Like, people don't want to waste money. People don't want to end up spending loads more than they do now, and they would like to maybe be kind of taken off the fuel price escalator a little bit. So if they can kind of cushion themselves from bill rises, that's good. But they're not necessarily looking to cut loads off their existing bills. They might be looking to be warmer for the same money, or something along those lines. I think that's something that isn't necessarily recognised as much, because there are probably easier ways to earn money as well. So,
and does that chime with your experiences, Ian?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. So I'd say, looking at Future Proof, which is a service where we give retrofit plans, and they're sort of paid for, using the home retrofit planner tool. I broadly say, as a sort of pen portrait, we have two sort of biggest groups of people who come to us. There's kind of quite well-off families living, because we do most of the work around the Bristol and Greater Bristol area, who've got slightly older children. So, you know, probably teenage, they're no longer small, they've got a bit more time and headspace, think about the home, they're relatively well off, you know, they might already own an EV or a hybrid, or they're thinking about the choice between retrofitting and that. And then there's another group who are more sort of just recently retired, or they're now working part-time, they're older, and retrofitting their home is something they've wanted to do for a long time. They've put off. This is like a sort of retirement project, but it's for them about creating a home that they can live in, like basically until they're much older. You know, it's making it comfortable. And I think for both of those households, they're fully aware of the issues with climate change, and they're sort of, you know, often doing it partly for those reasons, but also it's about making their home more comfortable, less about money, that I would say. And we also do a bunch of grant funded work where we do get people who come to us, and they're driven both by the fact that they're cold, but they're also driven by the desire to have an impact environmentally, even though they're all into a different group demographically.
It's interesting going back. One thing that we regularly notice is it's not about the money, and I think that very much that pretty much exemplifies an early adopter. It's not about the money, because if you're like one of the early adopters, you're buying technology that's like, you know, just recently been developed and maybe not hugely proven, then it's invariably it's the most expensive. We've not had the benefit of the trickle down economies of scale because it's not been adopted at a larger scale. So I think there's a definite commonality that you see within the early adopters for retrofit, at least. Right. So with that in mind, they're obviously sort of cut from a slightly different cloth than the great majority. So how do you think that their needs differ from those of the people in the mainstream? What do early adopters specifically look for?
Shall I kick off? I think a lot of the people that come to us for kind of detailed advice, they're incredibly knowledgeable. So I think, you know, we often deal with people who've gone away and thought about it in depth. You know, we're one of the heat pump ready projects, the DESNZ projects, to try and encourage the take up of heat pumps in a small area. One of the people that came to us in the first phase of that project was a sort of retired engineer, worked at Rolls-Royce. I would think he probably had mapped out his own heat pump distribution system in more detail than the heating engineers who are really qualified. So he was bringing to them questions that they were sort of slightly mind blown by. So I think that's quite a challenge actually for ourselves, and probably also for People Powered Retrofit, that often, because people are, you know, pretty clued up and they've done a lot of research, that can make the advice challenging, because, you know, you need to be at your game. I think that's the thing I would say. Dealing with the early adopters is not something that somebody could just hop on a retrofit academy, you know, get the qualification and then just go out and straight away and do the work. You need to have experience of housing. And I think for us, as a sort of, to try and get to net zero, that is a real challenge, because capacity is an issue. You can't just simply do courses to get the knowledge. You have to have the experience. You know, you've got two very experienced people in the room. You know, they've obviously built that experience up over time, and I think that's something, you know, you talked earlier about, you know, the general building sector as a sort of, you know, there's an army of builders out there that we can get to do retrofit. I don't think it's quite the same in the advice world. I think there's a lot needed to bring everyone's skills up to the level needed. Anyway, that's it.
To Jack briefly there, you were saying about the kind of clients who really know their onions, and it's sort of like, I'm regularly terrified when I arrive at somebody's house to do a survey, and it's, you know, often an older bearded gentleman, and they'll proceed to show me a number of graphs and spreadsheets and things, and sort of consumption figures and various things that go over my head, and it's just, please let me just measure how thick your walls are. Anyway, so going on to either Amy or Marianne on the same question, I mean, what do you think the needs of early adopters, how do they differ from your regular Joes and Josephines?
I think I'd echo a lot of what Ian has said, in that people tend to be reasonably well informed, although it does vary a lot. You know, some people understandably maybe don't want to become retrofit experts just in order to do. I think what people, they've done a lot of reading, they might have been on various webinars and read a few articles and got a good understanding. I think what they really need, and it reflects on some of the feedback that Cara was talking about as well, they'd really like to understand how that works in their house. So they might have read about heat pumps and understood the principles of it, or they might have read about wall insulation and understood the principles of it. But then looking at, you know, someone who's looked at buildings for a while and understands whether it suits them and their circumstances and whether their building is suitable for it. I think that's the bit that's really needed. So it, like Cara said before, it would be no good giving someone like that just an information sheet about this is solid wall insulation, because they already know. What they want to understand is how that applies in their particular case.
Yeah, and I think that goes back rather neatly again to the point that Cara raised about the lack of information around. That's why a lot of our clients who come to us are very knowledgeable about it, because it's born out of necessity. There's not, you know, you can't just go to Screwfix and say, oh, I want to insulate my house, and someone's going to hand you everything that you need. It's just not going to happen. So, but by mere definition of that, is people dive down into the, you know, they really do drill down into the detail of retrofit, and so we get asked some incredibly technical questions a lot of the time, and it's sort of, yeah, I mean, all credit to them, but this is it. They're floundering around, you know, getting lost in the mire of different materials and membranes and things without sort of easily accessed advice.
Well, I think just on that point as well, and then I'll let Amy through it, is that the other valuable thing that I think we do is, because people can get a little bit lost in the detail, is kind of step back and ask the question of, well, what is it you're actually trying to achieve in this? And then therefore advise from that, well, if you're really interested, if you're warm enough already and you really, all you're keen on is reducing your carbon emissions, then maybe going for a heat pump sooner rather than later is a good thing. If actually you've got damp problem, you know, it's that understanding what you're addressing, what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think there's a real vulnerability for early adopters, in that, like, as you were saying, Mark, that there's this transitioning. So not just tradespeople, but architects and designers, heating engineers, heating designers. They've got a whole load of applicable skills, but they're very much at the beginning, quite often, of transitioning those skills into retrofit. And so, as Cara was saying, like, when your car's broken, you can't just, you go to the garage and say, what's wrong with it? If your house needs retrofitting, if you just go to a builder and say, what does it need? You might, well, you probably won't get the right answer. So the householder or the early adopter is in this role of education. It's a two-way process. So they're doing research, gathering knowledge and skills, and then trying to work with tradespeople to build their knowledge to deliver what they need. And sometimes that can go very well, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think, I don't know if you'd agree, but sometimes you visit a householder who's done lots of research and they're a bit susceptible to salespeople, because if you're trying to sell a particular technology or system, then you're going to say why that system is so great. So I, for example, had a client a couple of weeks ago who was telling me why Phalonic foam is the best solution for a flat timber roof, because Kingspan's website tells him it is. And so he's somebody who's really trying hard to do his research, but it's not his area of expertise, and that leaves a real vulnerability for those early adopters. And I think that's where services like People Powered Retrofit and ours at Cumbria Action for Sustainability come in, because we're doing a bit of spotting. You know, we're spotting, aha, yes, we've had a client who's gone down that route before and this is what happened, or you know, or I can see there that you've gone down a bit of a wormhole there, but have you thought about this? And we can offer that broader overview and troubleshooting, if you like.
So I think we got, we'll probably leave about 10 minutes for questions, but from the audience and the online audience, Bob. One more from myself. How does a focus on early adopters potentially hinder the development of new services like yours? We know that the early adopters are great and they can inform strategy and help, but how might they hinder your development?
I think there are kind of two ways this might happen. One is that, no offense to anyone in the room or online, but you might end up with a set of proposals, approaches that are just too weird. People have, particular interests, and there are some people who are really, really keen on the idea of being completely off-grid. But that's probably not going to be something that's mass market appeal. Or there's people who want to make their house completely hurricane proof, which, climate adaptation is important, but it's unlikely that that's going to be applicable across the board. So there's that side of it. And then there is the chance, well, that kind of goes hand in hand with you need to develop a service that is kind of detailed enough but broad enough that it helps everybody along. And there's a risk of the service and the consultancy and the advice that you provide becoming kind of too locked into that detail, and that there's a real balancing act that is something that we kind of talk about all the time, that's going between like making something that's as if you're in a kind of factory churning out something down an assembly line, or something that's utterly bespoke. And I think we need to be somewhere in between those two things.
So it's a very good point, because generally speaking, there is a way of doing each aspect of retrofit. There's always a way of doing, there's always a best practice, but the conditions might vary in where that's being fitted, and so that needs to be taken into consideration, which is always the thing.
It's the context dependent nature of it that makes it
heavily context dependent, heavily. Amy, what are your thoughts on that? The possible hindrance.
So I'm trying to work out how to say this without offending anybody. But somebody who's an early adopter, who's me as well, so I'm offending myself, is a little bit special. They know they're pushing the boat out a little bit, and they're setting a good example, and they're trying to do something new and socially conscious and right. And if they're paying for support with that service through a retrofit service like the People Powered Retrofit, then there's perhaps a tendency to want to make that service a bit value added, so that person feels special, and they get documentation that's very bespoke, and it's got lovely pictures, and it makes them feel like they're part of this greater movement, and they're doing a great thing, and they've got this lovely product that values them and what they do. And that might add to the cost of it in one sense, but it might also put people off who don't see themselves in that category. So it makes it sort of embeds the fact it's not normal. It's special. So I don't know if that's a huge problem, but it's something we've been discussing a little bit, how to balance that.
Right, so the virtuous aspect of it, to a degree, almost. People sort of perceive the early adopters as too virtuous, and it's I don't know. Anyway, before I dig myself into a hole, Ian, what do you think on that? What do you think in terms of the early adopters? Obviously they are our friends, but they can be a hindrance. Have you experienced that, and if so?
So
in what kind of context?
So some experience from some time ago, not from the retrofit world, which is relevant. We ran a climate change engagement project, and we built a set, the 100 Ideas House, and we used a technique called value modes to segment the population. And broadly speaking, using Maslow's pyramid, you've got security driven people at the bottom, they, outer directed in the middle, inner directed at the top. Your early adopters are typically inner directed. They're very interested in the world, how it all connects. They've got much higher engagement around climate change and green issues. And then the outer directed band, which is like the greater majority of the UK population, are much more interested in, their appearance status. They're more driven by, success, really. And when we asked them for ideas for the 100 Ideas House, what we found was the inner directed people couldn't, they could tell us about 50 things, and we had to kind of literally try and shut them up. If you're outer directed, they knew that we as the experts knew more than them, and so they wanted us to tell them what the ideas were. This was important because we were running a competition. Give us an idea to enter the competition. So what we found is, the early adopters had all the ideas under the sun, but the general population, the people that we need to kind of engage to kind of accelerate retrofit, they're just not the same. They're going to be much more willing to listen to us, and they'll trust the answers we're giving them. So from a kind of delivery perspective, that might be slightly easier because we'll have less challenge and less people who are fixated on a single technology and some of the other things we deal with. But I think it also means that because we're telling people and they're trusting us, and then we're getting less challenge, there's some responsibility on ourselves to make sure that the advice we give is the correct advice, because they're more likely to follow it because they'll see that we're the experts. Hopefully that's helpful, although it was kind of digressing slightly away.
At least I think I find that absolutely fascinating. The inner directed and the outer directed. I'll be now adopting that as my own. I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's really, really interesting. I think we've just got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Shall we? Let me think. Let's go back over to Zurich. Zurich, can you hear us? Sandy, are you there? Do we have any questions?
Hi, Mark. Yeah, Old Trafford. Not Zurich, but yes, I have a question from Zizi. So Zizi says, everyone I know who has retrofit their home has done it bit by bit over a number of years rather than all in one go. Is this the way forward for new early adopters, or can it tip over into whole house retrofit as the norm?
Get that one again. I think we had some buffering going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So from Zizi, everyone I know who has retrofit their home has done it bit by bit over a number of years rather than all in one go. Is this the way to go forward for new early adopters, or can it tip over into whole house retrofits as the norm?
So speaking from experience, I think almost everyone does a phased retrofit in some way. Like they might have a big chunk of work done that stretches their time, patience, headspace, budget, sanity, and then does further things. So I think whether you go for phased or whole house retrofit, it's not always, well, people don't have the choice of just doing what's technically absolutely engineering best, because if you could do everything all at once and you could move out for 6 months or whatever, then that would be brilliant. But I think we have to be realistic and say that that's not going to be the case for most people. I think when we looked at it, it was a split. Maybe there was about a third of people who were interested in doing everything or as much as they could all in one go, and 2/3 who were planning to phase it. And yeah, it might be that with some people, and we have had it, where people are kind of wanting to do X amount of stuff, have realized that doing a little bit more gets them so far down the path so that they don't have to worry so much about other bits later on. So, you know, people who might go, right, if I can get my air tightness a bit better, then I can do swap out my heating system, that kind of thing. But I think that's gonna still be fairly rare, to be honest.
I think, Marianne, it's a shift in thinking as much as a shift in timescale. So you might be doing your retrofit work over 5 or 10 years, but if at the beginning you think of it as a whole house retrofit and you plan the whole thing and you understand how all the different things you're going to do are going to integrate and work with each other, you're going to get a whole house retrofit that's got high quality. Whereas if you start off by doing your loft insulation and then you think about your boiler and then your windows and then you think I might do some wall insulation, it's bitty and you don't get the whole benefit. So I think that shift can be more as much thinking as time.
Yeah, I think I should have probably said when we talk about whole house retrofit, we're not normally talking about doing all the work in one go. We're talking about thinking of all the work together and where all the junctions are and planning that out. And your plan might change over time, but at least if you've thought about it up front, you've got a fighting chance of it all sitting together neatly.
Fantastic. Anything to add to that, Ian? I think we will probably wind it up. If you've got any sort of closing comments.
Pretty sensible, to be honest. It chimes with our experience. What people really need is a plan, and they need to know what order to do things in to make it, to do the right thing sensibly.
Beautifully concise there. So I don't think maybe we could just to be even-handed about it. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Yes, we have a gentleman down at the front, please, Harriet.
Hi. So you talked about the existing supply chain in the industry, and from my experience of trying to work with that supply chain, the issue really, I think, is where did they go for advice?
That's a very, very good point. Yes. Anyone would like to jump in on that thorny issue of training the contractors?
Yeah. So just on that, we worked with the Green Register in Bristol, and they created Future Proof Essentials when we were doing Future Proof, which was great. And then they had to move it online because of COVID. But initially, when they were doing that, and they were sort of doing toolbox talks with sort of peer-to-peer learning, we were paying contractors to come along, and we were doing it outside of the core work hours. And I think that's one of the challenges that government doesn't really understand, that the majority of the supply chain are micro businesses, and if they're not working, they're not earning money. And that I think is a real challenge. So I don't have many answers to that other than government needing to realise that this is an infrastructure challenge on the scale of HS2. Controversial, probably talking about that whilst you're in the north, but it's that scale of challenge, and HS2 does have an apprentice program and all sorts of stuff that, to be honest, I think if we're going to get anywhere with retrofit, we need the same level of sort of coordination and planning and a general qualification, and all college courses building retrofit into them as a sort of like a standard. So but we're a long way off that, unfortunately.
I'd agree really and say that I think what we've got is an economic development problem, an investment in skills, but one that recognises who the existing contractors and people are working in the domestic refurbishment, because they're not the big tier one contractors. And in fact, the big tier one contractors mostly aren't interested in this stuff because they don't have the system set up that can deal with one-off, each house being slightly different, and they don't have the kind of client relation stuff, because some of that is as important, if not more important, than the technical skills. So it's the people who are successful local builders, or people who go into that, because I think we've had quite a lot of the people we know who are working as retrofit contractors and installers have come from a myriad of other walks of life and industries. There's people who started out as sculptors and have ended up in retrofit because they're interested in it. And I think there are the people that there's a bit of a thing to do around early adopters among that cohort as well, because there are people who are interested in this stuff either because they have climate concerns and or they enjoy the intellectual challenge of it. Like a lot of the really good, interesting retrofit contractors that I know started out as joiners who enjoy a good think about things and problem solving. So it's kind of tapping into that. But yeah, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge.
I kind of think it's interesting, and there might be people here that know more about this than me, but that you can't have done a bit of DIY on your own house or have had a similar job but not really the same at all, and then decide to be an electrician and set yourself up as an electrician or a heating engineer, because you need accreditations and insurance and all the rest of it to be legally allowed to do that. And I thought, well, why is that not the case for general builders or joiners? And I thought, well, actually, because maybe somebody's not going to die, like if you rewire the house really badly. But then actually, if you do retrofit really badly, there's a risk to life, because the risk of mold and so on is high, the risk of structural damage is high. So why is that not expectation of the skill level and the accountability of the person who implements those measures not raised? And that's an open question. I don't expect an answer.
It's a huge cultural thing in how we think about construction. Yeah.
Well, maybe let's part that huge cultural thinking for now, because we're pretty much out of time for this particular section. But I hope everyone found that illuminating, whether you're with us in Meet Space or online. We're going to just take a little break now. If people are staying online for the AGM, Sandy does have some online activities for you, and for the people who are with us in the room, please feel free to mingle and to have a drinkle and maybe something to eat as well. We've got some lovely food, vegetarian and vegan food at the back. And it just remains for me to say thank you all for joining us, and to our panelists, Ian, Preston, Amy Hield and Marianne Heaslip. Thank you very much.